Hello and welcome everyone to the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency's CISA Incident Response Training Series. Today's event is a one-hour awareness webinar, IR 109 Defend Against Ransomware Attacks. We're so glad you can join us today. Today, we have Ashley and Kobe as our instructors. Ashley is a senior instructional system designer with over 15 years of experience in adult learning and development. Her focus is primarily on building and evaluating cyber training programs. She currently supports the CISA training program by developing training content and facilitating training events such as this one. Kobe is an information security professional with over 20 years of experience in both the government and private sectors. His professional activities have included incident handling, forensics, penetration testing, vulnerability and risk assessments, course material creation, and instruction. Now, a few disclaimers before we get started. Thank you again for attending today's course. It's now my privilege to welcome Ashley, who will begin today's presentation. Over to you, Ashley.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Senna. And good morning, everyone. So let's jump into the agenda before we get too far down into our technical troubleshooting. All right. So over the next hour, my co-facilitator Kobe and I will present you with an introduction and overview to ransomware. It'll include the basic concepts associated with ransomware, like how to protect your system and information against an attack, and some common tactics and trends associated with ransomware. During the second half of the webinar, we'll use the Identify, Mitigate, and Respond framework to explain how to identify one of these attacks, best practices used to prevent and mitigate damage, and how to respond and recover in the event of an attack. We'll also present a series of case studies that will use real-world examples of how organizations responded to those attacks. Throughout today's webinar, like I mentioned before, we'll ask a few knowledge check questions to reinforce what you've learned. And like I said, you won't need to select the submit button. All you have to do is make your choice and your answer will be recorded. We'll close out today's webinar with a summary of what we've presented to you all and share with you some important resources that we think will be helpful. So, let's get into our objectives. So by the end of this course today, you should be able to enable your organization and you to be protected from ransomware attacks through the awareness of individual and organizational points of vulnerability. In order to do that, we are going to define ransomware. We're also going to present some preventative measures and detection and response best practices. So let's jump in. Now I'm going to go into what ransomware actually is. So, Kobe, can you walk us through what ransomware is and how we prevent it?
Certainly, but before we do get into any of the details, here's the website where we spent a lot of our time researching and providing resources. If you only walk away with this one piece of information from this course, it should be this website, https www.cisa.gov stop ransomware. So there are a lot of good resources there, guiding organizations through the basic process that they need to approach ransomware breaches. And we will go into a lot of the fundamentals of that throughout this class or webinar.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kobe. So now let's build a foundation of a conceptual understanding of this topic. So what is ransomware? Ransomware is a type of malicious software, like malware, that cybercriminals use to extort money from organizations. When the malware is activated, ransomware encrypts information stored on your computer and attached network drives and demands a ransom payment in exchange for the decryption key. Ransomware typically spreads through phishing emails or by a victim unknowingly visiting an infected website. And ransomware attacks are costly and disruptive. There are serious risks to consider before paying a ransom. And the federal government does not recommend paying ransom. When organizations are faced with an inability to function, they must evaluate all options to protect themselves and their operations. CISA and the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center released a joint ransomware guide in 2020. This guide is highly recommended as a reference source. I'm going to post the link in the chat to this guide. And also, if you look in the web links pod directly above the chat pod, you should find a link to that guide there as well. So the audience for this guide includes information technology or IT professionals, as well as others within an organization involved in developing cyber incident response policies and procedures or coordinating cyber incident response. This guide is a customer-centered one-stop resource with best practices and ways to prevent, protect, and respond to ransomware attacks. So the purpose of this guide is to inform and enhance your network defense and reduce exposure to ransomware attacks. And it uses the 4 phases of the incident response lifecycle defined by NIST. Those 4 phases are preparation, detection and analysis, containment, eradication, and recovery and post-incident activity. So next, I will hand it off to Kobe to talk to us about some ransomware trends.
Thank you very much, Ashley. So this is where it gets disturbing, some of these trends here. As you can see, these numbers are pretty big, and that's just an indicator that ransomware attacks, when pulled off successfully, are costly and disruptive. The economic reputational impacts have proven to be challenging for organizations both large and small. In 2021, the Internet Crime Report documented that it received 3,729 complaints identified as ransomware, with adjusted losses of more than $49.2 million. And so now, with the availability of cryptocurrencies, that number is increasing. The Chain Analysis 2022 Crypto Crime Report reported cryptocurrency ransomware payments totaled roughly $350 million in 2020. So attack trends do show an increase, a pretty drastic increase in attacks against critical infrastructure and organizations globally. The FBI, the Cybersecurity Agency, Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, and the NSA have observed incidents involving ransomware against 14 of the 16 U.S. critical infrastructure sectors. And these include defense industrial base, emergency services, food and agriculture, government facilities, and the IT sectors. So here we see a chart indicating the critical infrastructure victims of 2021. This is only the victims, so where successful attacks were accomplished as opposed to attempted. So ransomware threat actors they're targeting the big organizations or perceived high-value organizations and the critical services providers. So let's take a deeper look into infrastructure sectors victimized by ransomware. So here are the 16 critical infrastructure sectors whose assets, systems, and networks, whether physical or virtual, are considered so vital to the U.S. that their incapacitation or destruction would have a debilitating effect on our security, our national economy, public health and safety, or any combination. So of all the critical infrastructure sectors reportedly victimized by ransomware in 2021, the healthcare and public health, financial services, and info technology sectors were the most frequent victims, with anticipated increase in critical infrastructure victimization this year. So as a side note, the two sectors not listed were the dams sector and the nuclear reactors, materials and waste sector. So keep in mind that, like I said a second ago, this doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't targeted, but rather that they could have been targeted less or had better security controls in place. So here are some of the most prevalent ransomware variants that are targeting these critical infrastructures. So we have REvil up at the top, and I won't try to pronounce their other pronunciation. You have Lockbit and Conti. So there are others, but these were the most prevalent during this time period that we're basing these materials off of. So Conti was the most prevalent and frequent used against critical manufacturing, commercial facilities, and food and agriculture sectors. As of 2021, Conti was responsible for extorting over $100 million from victims. So now we move to Lockbit, who most frequently victimized government facilities, healthcare and public health, and financial services. REvil, the variant, was predominantly successful at victimizing financial services, IT, and healthcare and public health sectors. So these days, cyber criminals are just becoming more and more sophisticated and organized than ever before. So how many people here, you can have a raise of hands, have heard of ransomware as a service, or RAAS, RAS? All right, yeah, lots of you, that's good. So they've basically created an entire new as a service sector just to be focused on ransomware subscribers. And it's basically adopting the software as a service business model. RAS is a business model between ransomware operators and affiliates, in which affiliates pay to launch ransomware attacks developed by operators. RAS allows affiliates lacking the skill or the time to develop their own ransomware variant to be up and running quickly and affordably. They are easy to find on the dark web, where they are advertised in the same way that goods and services are advertised on legitimate websites. The ransomware operators do get paid for their service by taking percentages of the paid ransoms. The more sophisticated cybercriminals offer portals that let their subscribers see the status of their infections, total payments, total files encrypted, and other information about their targets. So they're getting very, very advanced. All right, I'm sure everybody is probably familiar with the concept of high-value targets. So some of these high-value targets are emergency communications operations that are crucial to public health and safety, where interruptions in service could result in a loss of life. So because they are so important, public safety answering points, PSAPs, and emergency communication centers, ECCs, are high-value targets for cyber threat actors. With attacks becoming more real, more frequent, and more destructive, this is what you can do immediately if you feel your computer is compromised. If you're connected with a cable to your network, immediately unplug that computer from the network physically. If you can't disconnect the computer from the network, unplug it from the power source. For laptops, hold down the power button until the light is completely off and remove the battery if possible. Then make sure to contact your IT department and supervisor immediately. So keep in mind that unplugging the power does affect the volatile memory and could destroy potential evidence. So that's really supposed to be used as a last resort. All right, Ashley, go ahead and explain to us some of the general best practices and hardening guidelines.
Yeah, definitely. So, we don't want to overload you with bullet points here, but these are all very important best practices that you and your organization must be aware of in order to defend your systems and your networks from an attack. So, doing all these things will greatly increase your defenses. While we go over those best practices, drop a comment if one of the bullets sticks out to you and is something that you're more interested in learning more about. So, from the top, here we go. First, you want to employ multi factor authentication for all of the services to the greatest extent possible in your network. So a lot of times we'll maybe set up MFA for one or two sites, but the reality is the more services or programs you have that have MFA required, the safer your network will be. Apply the principle of least privilege to all systems and services. Leverage best practices for securing cloud environments. Develop and regularly update the network diagram. Employ logical and physical means of network segmentation where possible. Have a comprehensive asset management approach. Restrict usage of PowerShell using group policies. Secure your domain controllers. Retain and adequately secure your logs. Baseline and analyze your network's activity to determine behavioral patterns. Training and phishing exercises for all of your network users is crucial, and that will help to raise awareness. Secure and monitor your remote desktop protocols and regularly maintain offline backups of your data. So, just curious, were there any best practices that seem the most interesting to you? Okay, Brian, this is interesting. Disaster recovery plans, those are truly crucial. And Wade, you make a great point that securing your RDP would go a long way. Um, so those things, they really are crucial and they make a huge difference. Keep in mind that it takes all of these good practices to defend against an attack. There is no silver bullet that takes care of all of these problems. These are all listed in the ransomware guide that we provided earlier and does include a detailed explanation for each of the items on this list. So we strongly recommend downloading the ransomware guide because it will go into greater detail about these best practices. So please make sure that you check that out if you're not familiar with any of that hardening guidance. And also, there are additional courses on ransomware available on FedVTE. So, if you're interested in learning more about things like how to set up firewall rules, how to apply, certain application allow listing policies, please check out our e-learning courses for the ransomware course. And Valerie, you are correct. I did not post the link. Let me put that in the chat right now. Uh, while I get that up for you. Okay, here we go. All right. Apologies, everyone. Thank you for your patience. Here is the link, but also like my like a member of our team shared, it is also located in the web links pod directly above the chat pod. So there's multiple ways that you can access it. All right, so let's get into some of our best practices, our other best practices. So in terms of identification, which is very valuable, during detection, there is a combination of technical actions for IT and cybersecurity professionals and communications that can happen during this phase, such as reporting to internal and external teams, stakeholders, and the public. During detection, focus is mainly on determining the impact and isolating or segmenting your network from further attacks. You want to identify the systems and accounts involved in an initial breach, and this can include email accounts. Only in the event you're unable to disconnect devices from the network, then you would power them down to avoid further spread of the ransomware infection. You want to triage your impacted systems for restoration and recovery, and confer with your team to develop and document an initial understanding of what has occurred based on initial analysis. Engage your internal and external teams and stakeholders with an understanding of what they can provide to help you mitigate, respond to, and recover from an incident. All right, so when we think about mitigation, we're all our own cybersecurity superhero. After initial detection and analysis comes mitigation. And during this phase of containment and eradication, you want to preserve your evidence in accordance with NIST 800 61 Revision 2. Take a system image and memory capture of a sample of affected devices like workstations and servers. Additionally, collect any relevant logs as well as samples of any precursor malware binaries and associated observables or indicators of a compromise, such as suspected command and control IP addresses, suspicious registry entries, or other relevant files that may be detected. Conduct an examination of current organizational detection or prevention systems like antivirus, endpoint detection and response IDS, and intrusion prevention systems and logs. This can highlight evidence of other systems or malware involved in earlier stages of the attack, as well as conduct extended analysis to identify outside in and inside out persistence mechanisms. Consult with federal law enforcement about possible decryptors available. So, they might have some resources that would be helpful to you. Security researchers have already broken the encryption algorithms for some ransomware variants, so you might have something available that you can just collect from federal law enforcement. NoMoreRansom.org is a solution for ransomware decryption. You want to research trusted guidance like the Cyber Incidents and Vulnerability Response Playbook or the Incident Response Checklist and follow the recommended steps that are outlined there. The MITRE ATT&CK framework is often used to identify indicators of a compromise. By show of hands, has anyone here used or seen the MITRE ATT&CK framework in their organizations? Awesome. That's what we like to see. So, so if you are familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, as it appears most of you are, that is great news. That's a great resource we highly recommend. Well, before we go to our next slide, I just wanted to share this, right? So we won't go over this framework today, but It is a great resource, and during a cyber attack, cyber criminals will use various techniques to infiltrate your networks, from initial access to lateral movement, privilege escalation, and so on and so forth. I'm going to share with you in the chat two links. One is to nomoreransom.org, which, once again, is also located in the web links pod directly above the chat pod. But also, here is the link to the MITRE ATT&CK frameworks. So MITRE ATT&CK is recognized as a knowledgeable base within the cybersecurity community for describing the behavior of adversaries across this lifecycle. This aids in the mitigation of vulnerabilities that may exist on your network, so we highly recommend utilizing it. Rebuild your systems based on a prioritization of critical services such as health and safety or revenue generating services, using pre-configured standard images if possible. Once the environment has been fully cleaned and rebuilt, including any associated impacted accounts and the removal or remediation of malicious persistence mechanisms, issue password resets for all affected systems, and address any associated vulnerabilities and gaps in security or visibility. This can include applying patches, upgrading software, and taking other security precautions that may have not been previously taken. And afterwards, you want to seek out assistance. Seek out outside assistance specifically. The designated IT or security IT authority declares the ransomware incident is over after you have taken all of these steps. So the purpose is to have this outside entity or the designated IT or IT security person that will be the one to officially declare your ransomware attack incident is over. So, lastly, once you have recovered, the last recovery and recovery and post incident response includes the following three major steps. And you can find these steps explained in greater detail in the ransomware guide. 1. Reconnect your systems and restore data from offline encrypted backups based on a prioritization of critical service. 2. Document your lessons learned from the incident and associated response activities to inform updates to and refine organizational policies, plans, and procedures, and guide future exercises of the same. 3. You want to consider sharing your lessons learned and relevant indicators of a compromise with CISA or your sector ISAC or ISAO for further sharing and to benefit others within the community, right? Just like the case studies we're going to be reviewing today, it's important for us to learn from one another. So we highly recommend that third step. Now, by show of hands, has anyone here heard of cyber insurance? Okay, so we have a lot of folks who have heard of it. Perfect. So, I'm going to put in the chat the link to a cyber insurance resource. So, like with everything, there's never a good time for bad things to happen. And cyber insurance is an option for your organization. So, just like most insurance companies, there are plans that you can choose from and consult with your advisors. And, for more information on how your cyber insurance can help with forensic services or crisis management. All right, so we have given you a lot of information, but we just wanted to hit you with a couple of knowledge checks before we move on to our case studies. So the first question we want to ask you all today is, of the following listed, what is an example of ransomware? I'm going to broadcast the results now that we have about 50%. So this is interesting. It seems like we are almost evenly split between the following options: all of the above or CryptoLocker. So if you selected CryptoLocker, you were correct. So Game Over Zeus and Zeus Trojan, those are examples of malware. Malware is different from ransomware, right? Because those are just malicious attacks. Ransomware is CryptoLocker is an example of ransomware because obviously it is locking down your account and asking you for a ransom to give you access to your network. All right, so let's go to our next knowledge check question. But great job, everyone, for your responses. And so the next question is, select the variant that did not victimize a critical infrastructure sector in 2021. Okay, so now I'm going to broadcast the results because it looks like the majority of folks have answered. And for those who chose WannaCry, you are correct. So the reason we chose WannaCry or included it in the list of options is that WannaCry has already been contained. Don't get us wrong, it is still dangerous, but it's actually not an example of malware. So let's go into our final knowledge check before we move on to our next section of this webinar. So, what's an example of a preventative measure that you can take against ransomware? So, we talked about this during our best practices. So, what are some options? All right, so now I will broadcast our results. Looks like the majority of folks have answered. All right, so if you chose update and patch your computer, you are correct. So in order to ensure that your network is secure and to prevent ransomware, it's important to update and patch your computer often, because that ensures that you're working off the most recent operating systems and that any potential patches have been repaired and closed down. So thank you all so much. And now we'll go back into our presentation and take a look at some case studies.
Thank you very much, Ashley. Great participation, everybody, both in the chat and answering the questions. We really like to see that kind of involvement. It makes us feel more useful. So during this section of the webinar, we chose 3 case studies involving real-world attacks. In each one, we're going to talk about how they occurred, what their impacts were, and what mitigation steps they took. So Colonial Pipeline, in case you didn't know, is an oil pipeline system that services the east coast of the United States. Kaseya is a global IT infrastructure provider that sells its technology to third-party service providers. And most of us know that JBS is one of the world's largest meat processors, or maybe that's just me. All right, first we're going to talk about the big Colonial Pipeline attack. It was major. In 2021, cyber actors deployed dark side ransomware against Colonial Pipeline. which is one of the largest distributors of fuel consumed on the East Coast. This attack is notably one of the worst attacks on critical infrastructure in the United States. The ransomware attack forced the pipeline company to shut down its operations for 6 days. After only a week of being shut down, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration had to declare a state of emergency in 18 states because of the shortages in supply. And according to Gas Buddy, 71% of the gas stations in North Carolina and 55% in Virginia were without gas. So DarkSide is a ransomware as a service, or RAS, that operates by using tactics such as phishing and RDP abuse, remote desktop, to gain initial access. Once they do gain access, they then use privilege escalation to perform lateral movements and gain access to the domain controllers or Active Directory. Once they are in and they do have elevated privileges, they then determine what files to encrypt and perform data exfiltration. Also, to stay under the radar and avoid detection, the malware code is itself often encrypted. So in this case, the DarkSide attackers gained access through an exposed password for a VPN account where the password was somehow compromised as part of a data breach. So who can think of what would have likely prevented that if you implemented it? They then stole 100 gigs of data and attacked infected computers with ransomware, including their billing and accounting systems. The ransomware used Salsa20, which is a stream cipher, and RSA encryption, and appended a random extension to the encrypted files. So the ransom note reported that the threat actor stole more than 100 gigs of data and threatened to publish the information if the ransom was not paid. The victims were presented with Bitcoin and Monero addresses to pay the cybercriminal for the decryption key. So as you can see, this was a very sophisticated, modern example of extremely well-organized attackers. It's not like a kid sitting in mom's basement anymore. I mean, there are literally criminal organizations that are jumping in on this stuff. So let's talk about the mitigation for Colonial Pipeline. So to prevent the further compromise and investigate the extent of the attack, professionals at the organization contacted a security investigation firm, law enforcement, the FBI, and CISA. The pipeline was taken offline to reduce additional exposure to network operations, but Colonial Pipeline did end up paying the DarkSide criminals to obtain the decryption key for the IT staff to regain control of its systems. Thankfully, the Department of Justice was able to recover approximately $2.3 million of the $4.4 million the attackers demanded for the ransom. Following this attack, the Biden administration issued an executive order directing U.S. government agencies to take a series of proactive steps to improve cybersecurity, as well as policy requirements for sharing threat information and data collections. So I'm going to go ahead and post another link here. It's a link to the executive order. Also, to make a note, NoMoreRansom.org is an organization that has a repository of keys and applications that may be able to decrypt data locked by different types of ransomware. So that's always a first resource to hit up. Next, we'll talk about the Kaseya attack. This occurred in 2020 when a global managed service provider was hit by a ransomware attack focused on their virtual system administrator software. The ransomware REvil, also known as Sodinokibi, deployed the malware during an automatic software update. The attackers were able to gain access to virtual system administrator servers through an authentication bypass flaw in the software. So the software's vulnerability to authentication, arbitrary file uploads, and code injectors are detailed in the CVE posted in the slide. This attack is an example of third parties and managed service providers infection vector, where adversaries often target the MSPs with the goal of compromising their client organizations. So what did they do? All in all, a total of 7 vulnerabilities within the software were identified and disclosed. Once the vulnerability was identified, Kaseya quickly worked to release a patch to its software to mitigate the vulnerabilities described in the CVE that we posted. However, the ransomware had already exploited customers before they could patch the system. Kaseya worked to analyze and communicate the impact to possible victims by performing a scan of the virtual server administrator's instances that were reachable via the internet, and by sending out notifications to the network owners. So it is important to audit user accounts all the time, regularly, especially the remote monitoring and management accounts that are publicly accessible. And that includes third-party access given to managed service providers. They should be vetted and monitored to ensure they are diligent with cybersecurity best practices as well as your organization's policies and procedures. All right, next we'll talk about the JBS attack. Once again, a meat supplier in the US that paid $11 million during a 2021 ransomware attack, which once again led to a shutdown of their entire operation, just like Kaseya. So REvil was the criminal group behind the shutdown, and it was confirmed publicly through investigation that employee data had been in fact compromised. So how'd they do it? After doing some log analysis, the investigation identified that there were failed connection attempts using RDP connections to the JBS Australia IP address space right before the data exfiltration took place. The attempts were discovered or were from an IP source that was not associated with any known digital footprint inside JBS. As it turns out, the malicious attempts were made by the attacker as a form of reconnaissance, where they discovered a vulnerable port which allowed them to perform data exfiltration through. RDP is Remote Desktop Protocol. So that's what you use to remote into a Windows workstation or a server. All right, JBS, the mitigation aspect. So although they did end up paying the ransom, here are the other steps they took to mitigate the attack. They took all the affected systems offline, notified authorities, and performed analysis. Then they consulted with IT firms to step in to contain the threat, and they identified what important data was compromised during the attack. So CISA recommends that for internet-facing vulnerabilities, agencies should conduct regular vulnerability scanning to identify and address vulnerabilities to limit the attack surface. CISA does offer a no-cost vulnerability scanning service and other no-cost assessments. However, that's limited to certain entities, governmental entities and others. Additionally, you should audit your networks for systems using RDP closed by any unused RDP ports, enforce account lockouts after a specified number of attempts, apply multi-factor authentication, and log RDP login attempts. I also recommend using what's called a jump host. So it just segments up the connection from the outside, the remote connection, which decreases your vulnerability. So these mitigation steps and others can be found in that ransomware guide link that we've provided in the web links and also in the chat. So Ashley, go ahead and ask I think we have some knowledge checks.
That's correct. So Um, let's see. Don had a really great question in the chat as well about vulnerability testing vendors. So if we could get to that, I think that's a really good question to ask. But before we close out, I wanted to test your knowledge one more time. So we have our last two knowledge check questions. So, what is RAS? Based on everything that we have shared with you here today, what do you think the definition of RAS is? And I'm going to broadcast the results now. And for those of you who selected the second option, you are correct. RAS is a business model that allows hackers to launch ransomware attacks for their customers. Like Kobe mentioned, this is not your, basement dwelling hackers anymore. This is a sophisticated business model that folks are using to generate a lot of profit for the bad guys. So thank you so much for your participation in that. And let's go to our final question. Which of these would not be considered an indicator of a compromise collected during the mitigation phase? Mm. So I'm going to broadcast the answers because this one is, it seems like folks are having a couple different ways that they're going with this choice. So I'll give y'all let's like couple more seconds. Okay. So it looks like we have a good amount. We have a consensus of options. If you selected end of life software, unfortunately, you're incorrect. The correct answer is intrusion prevention systems. That is not an indicator of a compromise that would be collected during the mitigation phase. Can anyone in the chat tell me why that is? Why would IPS not be an indicator of a compromise that you would look for in the mitigation phase? Mohammed, great call out because it's a tool. It is a tool that we use to uh, prevent a compromise. Exactly. Thank you all so much. This is good. This is good. I'm glad that we're getting a chance to really exercise our skills here. Okay, so now, before we close this out, I want to just do a quick summary of what we've gone over today. So, during our time together, we defined ransomware and noted some of the tactics and trends we can use to identify ransomware. We described preventative measures that could be employed to defend against ransomware attacks, and we provided you with options and best practices for how to detect, mitigate, and respond to a ransomware attack. Once again, we highly recommend you check out FedVTE and our CISA training site for other training courses that we have available. We have just launched our ransomware e-learning course. Please check that out. I think you'll really enjoy it. And also, we hope to see you again at our future webinar. Thank you all so much, and we hope you have a great rest of your week.